The golden sun cast long shadows across the dusty grounds of the Carson City livestock auction, as Gabriella Morgan sat alone on a rough-hewn bench, her gloved hands clutching a small leather satchel, so tightly her knuckles whitened beneath the fabric. The year was 1878, and at 22, she had nowhere left to go after her father's farm had been seized for unpaid debts following his passing 3 months prior. Xavier Thornton noticed her immediately. Not because she was beautiful, though she certainly was, with auburn hair escaping in wisps from beneath her modest bonnet, but because she was clearly out of place among the boisterous ranchers and cattle buyers. His spurs clinked softly as he approached, pushing back his worn Stetson to reveal sun-weathered features and eyes the color of a summer storm. "You look like you're waiting on something more than just the bidding to start, madam," he said, maintaining a respectful distance. Gabriella startled, looking up at the tall figure blocking the afternoon sun. "I'm waiting for my chance, sir," she replied with quiet dignity. "I have one horse left to my name, and I need to fetch a good price." Xavier's gaze softened. He'd heard about the Morgan place being seized by the bank. Hard times were no stranger to Nevada territory, especially for those trying to make it on their own. Xavier Thornton, he introduced himself with a slight tip of his hat, owner of the Silver Crest Ranch about 20 miles east. "Gabriella Morgan," she responded, her voice barely audible above the auctioneer's calls starting up at the far end of the yard. Xavier leaned against the post beside her bench, watching as buyers gathered around a pen of cattle. "Which horse is yours?" "The chestnut mare with the white blaze," Gabriella replied, gesturing toward the corral where several horses stood. "My father bred her himself. Her name is Penny." Xavier studied the horse with an expert eye. Good conformation, strong legs, and a gentle disposition from what he could tell. Worth a decent sum to the right buyer. As the auction progressed, Xavier remained by Gabriella's side, noting how she flinched each time the gavel fell. When they finally brought Penny into the auction ring, Gabriella stood, unconsciously reaching for Xavier's arm for support. "Starting bid at $15 for this fine chestnut mare," the auctioneer called. Xavier could feel Gabriella trembling beside him. $15 was insultingly low for a horse of that quality. "20, called a voice from the crowd. "25, countered another. Gabriella's grip tightened on Xavier's sleeve as the bidding continued, but it stalled at $30, far less than what she needed to secure even temporary lodging and passage to her distant cousin in Sacramento. Xavier raised his hand. $50. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The auctioneer pointed his gavel at Xavier. "50 from Thornton." "Do I hear 55? The crowd fell silent. Everyone knew Xavier Thornton didn't make frivolous purchases. If he valued the horse at 50, no one was inclined to challenge him. "Sold to Xavier Thornton for $50, the auctioneer declared, bringing down his gavel with finality. Gabriella released Xavier's arm, a mixture of relief and sorrow washing over her face. "Thank you for driving up the price, Mr. Thornton. That's very kind of you." Xavier turned to face her fully, his expression unreadable. "The horse is worth twice that," he said matter-of-factly. Then, glancing around at the crowd dispersing for the day's final auction lots, he added, "And she's not the only one leaving with me today." Gabriella's eyes widened. "I beg your pardon." Xavier's weathered face softened just slightly. "Miss Morgan, I'm not in the habit of leaving folks to the mercy of chance. I've got a proposition for you, a job at Silvercrest. My sister Helen manages the household, and she's been looking for help." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "You'd have a roof over your head, regular meals, and honest pay, and you'd be near your horse. She's coming home with me," he stated simply to a passing ranch hand who'd been eyeing Gabriella with interest. The directness of his declaration left Gabriella speechless. She'd come to the auction prepared to say goodbye to the last connection to her father and her former life. Now this stranger, this cowboy, was offering her not only money, but a place to stay. "Why would you do this for someone you don't know?" she finally asked, suspicion edging into her voice. She'd heard stories about young women lured into compromising situations by seemingly kind offers. Xavier recognized her hesitation. "Miss Morgan, my proposition is entirely proper. You'll meet my sister immediately upon arrival, and the bunkhouse for female workers is separate from the main house and men's quarters." He pulled a folded paper from his vest pocket. "Here's a letter from the bank that foreclosed on your property. I was considering purchasing some of your father's land to expand my grazing area when I heard about the auction today." Gabriella took the letter with trembling fingers. It was authentic, an inquiry about the Morgan property addressed to Xavier Thornton from the First Bank of Carson City. "I have no right to ask for your trust," Xavier continued, "but I'm offering you a fair opportunity. And if you find the arrangement unsuitable after a week, I'll personally ensure you reach your people in Sacramento with your horse and wages in hand." The sun was beginning to dip below the mountains, casting long shadows across the auction yard. Gabriella had nowhere to sleep that night. The room at the boarding house had been paid through noon that day with the last of her savings. "I accept your offer, Mr. Thornton," she said with quiet dignity. "But I insist on earning my keep. I'm not afraid of hard work." Xavier nodded, a hint of respect flickering in his eyes. "I'd expect nothing less. We leave within the hour once I settle accounts." He paused, then added more gently, "And Miss Morgan, your father bred fine horses. Penny will have a good home at Silvercrest." For the first time since he'd approached her, Gabriella's lips curved into a small smile. "Thank you, Mr. Thornton." The journey to Silvercrest Ranch began as the last rays of daylight faded from the western sky. Xavier's wagon rolled steadily along the rutted trail, with Penny tethered behind. Gabriella sat on the bench seat beside him, her small satchel containing all her worldly possessions tucked securely at her feet. "The territory can be beautiful at night," Xavier commented, breaking the silence that had stretched between them for several miles. Above them, stars began to prick the darkening canvas of the sky. "It reminds me of nights on our farm," Gabriella replied softly. "My father used to point out constellations from our porch." The memory brought both comfort and pain. Xavier nodded, keeping his eyes on the trail ahead. "My father did the same, said a man could always find his way home with the stars to guide him." "Is that how you found your way to Silvercrest?" she asked. A rare smile touched Xavier's lips. "In a manner of speaking. I came west after the war. The stars may have guided me, but it was blind luck that brought me to this particular valley." He adjusted his grip on the reins. "I started with 50 acres and 6 cattle. Now Silvercrest spans almost 2,000 acres. "That's impressive," Gabriella said genuinely. "You built all that yourself?" "With these hands and a fair amount of stubbornness," he confirmed. Then, after a moment's hesitation, he added, "and with Helen's unwavering support. She followed me west when our parents passed, refused to let me turn wild out here on my own." The mention of his sister seemed to ease some of Gabriella's lingering apprehension. A man who inspired such loyalty from family couldn't be all bad. As they traveled, Xavier pointed out landmarks visible in the moonlight, a distinctive rock formation called Eagle's Perch, the silver ribbon of a stream that ran through his property, and finally, the distant pinpricks of light that marked the ranch buildings of Silvercrest. "We'll be there in about half an hour," he informed her. "The main house, Bunkhouses and barn form a sort of square, with the corral in the center. Helen's had a room prepared in the women's quarters since I sent word ahead with one of my hands who left the auction early. Gabriella nodded, suddenly nervous at the prospect of meeting the household and establishing herself in yet another new situation. Reading her silence correctly, Xavier spoke again. "Folks at Silvercrest are good people, Miss Morgan. Most have known hardship of one kind or another. No one will pry into your business." "I appreciate that," she responded quietly. As they approached the ranch, Gabriella could make out more details: a large two-story house constructed of sturdy timber, several smaller buildings clustered nearby, and a sprawling barn with corrals attached. Lanterns glowed in windows, casting warm rectangles of light onto the packed earth of the yard. A figure emerged from the main house as Xavier guided the wagon into the yard, calling out a greeting. The woman who approached was tall and angular, with the same storm-gray eyes as Xavier, though her hair was a rich brown rather than his sun-bleached sandy color. "You've returned safely," she called, then turned her gaze to Gabriella. "And this must be Miss Morgan." Xavier set the brake and jumped down from the wagon, turning to offer Gabriella assistance. "Helen, this is Miss Gabriella Morgan. Miss Morgan, my sister, Helen Thornton." Gabriella accepted Xavier's hand and stepped down from the wagon, straightening her travel-worn dress as best she could before extending her hand to Helen. "Pleased to meet you, Miss Thornton. Thank you for opening your home to me." Helen took Gabriella's hand in a firm grip. "Any friend of Xavier's is welcome at Silvercrest," she said warmly. "And please call me Helen. We don't stand on ceremony here." She looked her brother up and down with a critical eye. "You look exhausted, Xavier. Go get something to eat while I show Miss Morgan to her quarters." Xavier nodded, then turned to Gabriella. "I'll see to Penny myself. She'll be settled in the stable with fresh hay and water before I turn in." "Thank you," Gabriella said, grateful for his consideration of her beloved horse. Helen linked her arm through Gabriella's and led her toward one of the smaller buildings. "That's the women's bunkhouse," she explained. "Currently home to our cook, Mrs. Abernathy, and Sarah, who helps with housekeeping. You'll meet them properly in the morning." The bunkhouse was simple but clean, with 6 narrow beds arranged along the walls. Only 3 showed signs of occupation. Helen led Gabriella to an empty bed near a small window. "I've had fresh linens put on, and there's a trunk under the bed for your belongings," she said. "The washroom is through that door. We're quite proud of our indoor pump. It's a luxury out here." Gabriella set her satchel on the bed. "This is more than adequate, thank you." Helen studied her for a moment. "You must be tired and hungry after your journey. Would you prefer to eat now or rest first?" "If it's not too much trouble, I'd like to eat something," Gabriella admitted. "I haven't had much today." Helen's expression softened with understanding. "Of course. Come to the main house when you're ready. Take your time." Left alone, Gabriella opened her satchel and removed her few possessions: 2 dresses besides the one she wore, undergarments, a hairbrush, a small framed photograph of her parents, and her mother's Bible. She arranged them carefully in the trunk, smoothing a hand over the dresses to remove the worst of the wrinkles. After washing her face and hands at the pump and pinning her hair more neatly, she made her way to the main house. The smell of food greeted her as she approached the door Helen had indicated she should use. Inside, she found herself in a large, warm kitchen. A heavy wooden table dominated the center of the room, where Xavier sat with a plate of food. Helen stood at the stove, ladling stew into a bowl. "Come in, Miss Morgan," Helen called. "Sit down and have some of Mrs. Abernathy's venison stew. It's her specialty." Gabriella took a seat across from Xavier, who acknowledged her with a nod before returning to his meal. Helen placed a steaming bowl before her, along with a thick slice of bread. "Thank you," Gabriella said, suddenly ravenous at the rich aroma. They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes before Helen spoke again. "Xavier tells me you're skilled with horses." Gabriella glanced up. "My father bred and trained them. I helped from the time I was old enough to hold a lead rope." "That's valuable knowledge," Helen commented. "We could certainly use someone with your experience helping with our horses." Xavier set down his fork. "I told Miss Morgan she'd be helping you with household matters, Helen." His sister raised an eyebrow. "I think Miss Morgan should decide where her talents are best utilized, don't you?" Gabriella looked between the siblings, sensing an undercurrent to their conversation. "I'm willing to help wherever I'm needed," she offered diplomatically. Xavier's expression remained unreadable, but he inclined his head slightly. "We can discuss duties tomorrow. It's been a long day for everyone." After they finished eating, Helen showed Gabriella back to the bunkhouse. "Don't mind my brother," she said as they walked across the yard. "He's protective by nature, especially of newcomers to the ranch." "He's been very kind," Gabriella replied. Helen smiled. "Kind, yes, but he can be stubborn as a mule. If you find yourself butting heads with him, come to me. I've had 35 years of practice managing him." As Gabriella prepared for bed that night, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch settling for the evening, she felt an unexpected sense of peace. For the first time since her father's death, she wasn't completely alone. Whether Silvercrest would become a true home remained to be seen. But for tonight, she had shelter, food in her stomach, and her beloved Penny nearby. She drifted to sleep thinking of storm-gray eyes and the deep voice that had declared, "She's coming home with me." Gabriella woke before dawn to the sounds of movement in the bunkhouse. Opening her eyes, she saw a plump, gray-haired woman bustling about, pulling on a shawl over her dress. "Good morning," the woman said cheerfully when she noticed Gabriella was awake. "You must be Miss Morgan." "I'm Edith Abernathy, cook for this hungry lot." She gestured to another bed where a young woman with blonde hair was sitting up, yawning. "That's Sarah." "Pleased to meet you both," Gabriella said, sitting up and smoothing her hair. "Please call me Gabriella." "Well, Gabriella, Mrs. Abernathy continued. "Breakfast is in 30 minutes in the main house. The men eat in the cookhouse next to the bunkhouse, but the Thorntons and us women take our meals in the kitchen." Gabriella quickly washed and dressed, eager to make a good impression on her first full day at Silvercrest. She chose her best remaining dress, a simple blue cotton with white collar, and pinned her hair in a neat bun at the nape of her neck. Sarah, who couldn't have been more than 18, fell into step beside her as they walked to the main house. "Miss Helen says you're good with horses," she said by way of greeting. "I've worked with them most of my life," Gabriella confirmed. Sarah nodded enthusiastically. "That's wonderful. I'm terrified of them myself, those big teeth and heavy hooves." She shuddered dramatically. "But Mr. Thornton's horses are the pride of the county. Everyone says so." The kitchen was warm and fragrant with the smell of coffee, bacon, and biscuits when they entered. Helen was already seated at the table, alongside a man Gabriella hadn't met, weathered and gray-haired, with a kindly face. "Good morning, Gabriella," Helen greeted her. "This is George Fletcher, our foreman. George, this is Miss Gabriella Morgan." "Madam," George acknowledged with a respectful nod. "Welcome to Silvercrest." "Thank you," Gabriella replied, taking the seat Helen indicated. Mrs. Abernathy bustled around the kitchen, placing platters of food on the table. "Eat up," she encouraged. "Day starts early and ends late on a ranch." As they began to serve themselves, Xavier entered the kitchen, already dressed for the day in worn denim, a cotton shirt, and sturdy boots. His hair was damp, suggesting he'd already washed. "Morning," he greeted the table collectively, taking a seat beside George. His eyes met Gabriella's briefly. "Sleep well, Miss Morgan." "Very well, thank you," she replied, surprised to find herself blushing slightly under his direct gaze. Helen passed the platter of biscuits to her brother. "I was just about to tell Gabriella about the work schedule here. George needs help breaking those new colts that came in last week, and I thought Miss Morgan will be helping Mrs. Abernathy and Sarah with household duties for now," Xavier interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. "At least until she's had time to settle in." Gabriella set down her fork carefully. "Mr. Thornton, while I appreciate your concern, I'm quite capable of working with horses. It's what I know best." Xavier met her gaze steadily. "The colts we're breaking are half-wild mustangs, Miss Morgan. Even experienced hands have been thrown." "Xavier," Helen said with a hint of exasperation, "Gabriella deserves the chance to prove her abilities. You can't keep her confined to the house out of some misplaced sense of protection." The table fell silent as everyone watched the siblings standoff. Finally, Xavier sighed. "We'll compromise. Miss Morgan can assist with the gentle stock for now, the mares and the riding horses that need exercise. If that goes well, we can discuss the colts." Gabriella nodded, satisfied with this arrangement. "That's reasonable. Thank you." After breakfast, George showed Gabriella around the stables, introducing her to the various horses in Xavier's extensive stock. Her heart lifted when she spotted Penny in a comfortable stall, contentedly munching on fresh hay. "She settled in nicely," George commented, noticing Gabriella's smile. "Boss made sure she had the best stall we could offer." "That was kind of him," Gabriella said, reaching out to stroke Penny's velvety muzzle. George leaned against the stall door. "Mr. Thornton doesn't do things halfway, miss. If he takes something on, whether it's a horse, a plot of land, or a person, he commits fully." Gabriella considered this as she examined Penny's hooves and legs, checking for any issues after the journey. "He seems to run a good operation here. Best in the territory," George confirmed proudly. "Started from nothing, he did. Now we supply horses to the Army, the stage companies, and private buyers all over Nevada and California." He gestured around the immaculate stable. "Every nail and board in this place was put here according to his specifications." "And his sister?" Gabriella asked, curious about the dynamic she'd witnessed. "Has she always been involved?" George chuckled. "Miss Helen. She's been the boss's right hand since they came west. Smart as a whip, that one. Manages the books, helps with breeding decisions, keeps the house running smooth. Between the two of them, there's not much they can't handle." As the morning progressed, Gabriella found herself assigned to exercise several of the gentle riding horses. She saddled a docile mare named Buttercup and led her to the smaller of the two corrals, away from where Xavier and several ranch hands were working with the wild mustangs. Despite her attempt to focus on her own task, Gabriella couldn't help stealing glances at Xavier. He moved with confidence and precision, communicating with the half-wild horse through subtle body language and quiet commands. The mustang, a magnificent bay stallion, snorted and pranced nervously, but gradually began responding to Xavier's guidance. "He has a way with them, doesn't he?" Gabriella turned to find Helen watching her from the corral fence. "Yes," she admitted. "My father was good with horses, but Mr. Thornton seems to speak their language." Helen smiled knowingly. "Our father was a cavalry officer. Xavier learned horsemanship practically before he could walk." She nodded toward Buttercup. "How are you finding our stock?" "Well trained and cared for," Gabriella replied honestly as she adjusted the mare's stirrups. "Buttercup is particularly sweet-natured." "She's one of our most reliable mounts," Helen agreed. "Perfect for a lady's pleasure riding." Gabriella swung up into the saddle with practiced ease. I prefer a bit more spirit, actually. Penny has always been spirited without being difficult. Helen's eyes sparkled with interest. Is that so? Perhaps tomorrow you might try Thunder, that gray gelding in the end stall. He's well-mannered, but has more energy than most of our ladies' mounts. I'd like that very much, Gabriella said, gathering the reins. As she guided Buttercup around the corral at a walk, then a trot, Gabriella was acutely aware of Xavier's gaze occasionally falling upon her. Once, when she executed a particularly smooth transition from trot to canter, she glanced up to find him watching with undisguised interest from the adjoining corral. The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity. After exercising 3 different horses, Gabriella helped George with grooming and feeding. Later, she assisted Mrs. Abernathy with preparing dinner, then joined the household for the evening meal. How did you find your first day at Silvercrest, Miss Morgan? Xavier asked as they sat around the table. Fulfilling, she answered truthfully. Your horses are magnificent, Mr. Thornton. A hint of pride crossed his features. Thank you. I understand you managed Buttercup, Daisy, and Oliver today. Yes, she confirmed. Miss Thornton suggested I might try Thunder tomorrow. Xavier's eyebrows rose slightly as he glanced at his sister. Thunder requires a firm hand. He can be headstrong. Like someone else I know, Helen muttered into her coffee cup. Gabriella suppressed a smile. I'm confident in my abilities, Mr. Thornton. Xavier studied her for a moment, then nodded. Very well, but I'd like to be present the first time you ride him if you don't mind. Not at all, Gabriella agreed, secretly pleased at the prospect of demonstrating her skills before him. That night, as Gabriella prepared for bed, Sarah perched on the edge of her own bed, eager to chat. I saw you riding today, the younger woman said admiringly. You sit a horse like you were born in the saddle. My mother used to say the same thing, Gabriella replied with a fond smile as she brushed out her long auburn hair. She never understood my fascination with horses, but she supported it nonetheless. And Mr. Thornton was watching you, Sarah added with a knowing grin. He doesn't usually pay such close attention to new workers. Gabriella felt heat rise to her cheeks. I'm sure he was simply ensuring I didn't mishandle his horses. Sarah giggled. If you say so, but I've been here 2 years and I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looked at you today. Sarah, Mrs. Abernathy admonished from her bed, don't go putting ideas in Miss Morgan's head. Mr. Thornton is our employer and that's all there is to it. But as Gabriella slipped beneath her covers and blew out her bedside candle, she couldn't help but remember the intensity in Xavier's storm-gray eyes when he'd watched her ride. It had been a look of assessment, certainly, but perhaps something more as well. The following morning dawned clear and cool, perfect weather for working with horses. After breakfast, Gabriella made her way to the stables, her heart beating a little faster at the prospect of riding Thunder under Xavier's watchful eye. She found him already in the stable, brushing down the gray gelding with long, methodical strokes. He glanced up as she approached, nodding in greeting. Good morning, Miss Morgan, he said, continuing his work. I thought I'd prepare Thunder myself this morning. Good morning, Mr. Thornton, she replied, moving closer to inspect the horse. Thunder was larger than the mounts she'd ridden the previous day, with powerful shoulders and a proud carriage to his head. He's beautiful. And he knows it, Xavier commented with a hint of amusement. That's half his problem, too smart for his own good and vain as a peacock. Gabriella reached out slowly, allowing Thunder to catch her scent before she stroked his neck. Hello, handsome, she murmured. The gelding's ears flicked forward with interest. Xavier watched her interaction with the horse carefully. He likes you. The feeling is mutual, Gabriella said, running her hands down Thunder's legs to check his tendons. Her movements were confident and practiced, betraying years of experience. Xavier handed her the brush. "Finish grooming him. I want to see how he responds to your handling before you mount." For the next several minutes, Gabriella worked in companionable silence beside Xavier, who retrieved Thunder's tack from the saddle room. She was acutely aware of his presence, the subtle scent of leather and pine that seemed to cling to him, the careful way he assessed both her and the horse. "Your father taught you well," Xavier observed as she checked Thunder's hooves with practiced ease. "He believed a horse person should know every aspect of care, from mucking stalls to complex training," she replied, setting down the gelding's hoof gently. "He said you can't truly communicate with an animal unless you understand its needs completely." "A wise man," Xavier said softly. He held out Thunder's saddle. "Ready." Together they saddled the gelding, their hands occasionally brushing as they worked. Each brief contact sent an unexpected warmth through Gabriella's body, causing her to fumble slightly with the girth strap. "Let me," Xavier said, reaching around her to secure the buckle. His chest pressed briefly against her shoulder, and Gabriella held her breath at the proximity. Once Thunder was tacked, Xavier led the way to the corral. Several ranch hands paused in their morning chores to watch as Gabriella prepared to mount. She could feel their curious stares but kept her focus on the task at hand. "He may test you initially," Xavier warned, holding Thunder's bridle as Gabriella gathered the reins. "If he feels uncertainty, he'll take advantage." "I understand," she said, meeting Xavier's gaze steadily. Something unspoken passed between them, a challenge perhaps, or a measure of growing respect. Xavier stepped back and Gabriella swung gracefully into the saddle. Thunder immediately stiffened, his head rising as he sensed a new rider. He sidestepped nervously, but Gabriella remained centered, her body moving fluidly with the horse's motion. "Easy, boy," she murmured, keeping the reins firm but not restrictive. "Let's get to know each other." Xavier leaned against the corral fence, his expression unreadable as he watched Gabriella begin working Thunder at a walk around the perimeter. The gelding tried several times to take control, tossing his head, breaking gait unexpectedly, but each time, Gabriella corrected him with quiet confidence. After 15 minutes, Thunder was responding beautifully, moving from walk to trot to canter at the slightest cue from Gabriella. She guided him through figure eights and serpentines, demonstrating the horse's flexibility and her own skill. When she finally brought Thunder to a halt before Xavier, both horse and rider were breathing harder from the exertion, but there was a harmony between them that hadn't existed before. "Impressive," Xavier said simply, but the approval in his eyes spoke volumes. Gabriella couldn't help the smile that spread across her face. "He's exceptional, Mr. Thornton, responsive and intelligent." "As is his rider," Xavier replied, the compliment delivered so matter-of-factly that Gabriella almost missed it. He reached up to take Thunder's bridle. "Walk him out, then you can help George with the yearlings in the south pasture." As Gabriella dismounted, her hand briefly covered Xavier's where it rested on the bridle. Their eyes met for a heartbeat longer than necessary before she looked away, suddenly flustered. "Thank you for the opportunity, Mr. Thornton," she said, taking Thunder's reins and leading him toward the stable. She could feel Xavier's gaze following her retreat, and something warm unfurled in her chest, a feeling she hadn't experienced before, both unsettling and exhilarating. Over the next 2 weeks, Gabriella fell into the rhythm of life at Silvercrest. Her days were filled with work, exercising horses, assisting George with training, helping Mrs. Abernathy with household chores in the evenings. She found herself looking forward to mealtimes when Xavier would be present. their conversations gradually becoming less formal and more genuine. She learned that Xavier had fought for the Union during the Civil War, returning home to find their parents had died of influenza during his absence. With nothing left for them in Pennsylvania, he and Helen had sold the family property and headed west to start anew. "It must have been difficult," Gabriella commented one evening as they sat on the porch after dinner, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson. Helen had retired early with a headache, leaving them alone. Xavier's expression grew distant. The war changed everything, coming home to empty rooms and fresh graves. He trailed off, then shook his head slightly. "The West offered something neither of us could find back east, a chance to build something that was entirely our own, unconstrained by expectations or memories." "And you've succeeded remarkably," Gabriella observed, gesturing to the prosperous ranch spread before them. A slight smile touched Xavier's lips. "We've been fortunate and stubborn." He glanced at her. "What would your father think of Silvercrest?" The question caught Gabriella off guard. She considered it carefully before answering. "He would have admired your breeding program and the quality of your stock." She smiled softly. "And he would have been grateful that Penny found a good home here." Xavier nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression. High praise indeed, coming from a man who bred horses like Penny. They fell into comfortable silence, watching as the first stars appeared in the deepening blue of the evening sky. Gabriella was acutely aware of Xavier, beside her the steady rhythm of his breathing, the faint scent of leather and sunshine that seemed to cling to him. "Miss Morgan," he said finally, his voice unusually hesitant, "are you finding your place here at Silvercrest agreeable?" Gabriella turned to look at him, surprised by the vulnerability in his question. "Very much so, Mr. Thornton. More than I expected, truthfully." Relief flickered across his features. "I'm glad to hear it. Your work with the horses has been exceptional. George speaks highly of your abilities." "Thank you," she said, warmth spreading through her at his praise. Xavier seemed about to say more when the sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted them. A rider galloped into the yard, his horse lathered with sweat from hard riding. Xavier was on his feet immediately. All traces of the personal conversation vanished as he strode to meet the newcomer. "Jessup." "What's happened?" The rider dismounted quickly, his expression urgent. "Fire, boss. Lightning strike up in the North Ridge. It's spreading fast toward the summer pasture where the mares and foals are grazing." Xavier's face hardened. "Wake everyone. We'll need all hands." He turned to Gabriella, who had followed him into the yard. "Miss Morgan, please inform Helen. We'll need provisions prepared for the men. It could be a long night." Without waiting for a response, he strode toward the stable, already calling out orders to the hands who were emerging from the bunkhouse in response to the commotion. Gabriella hurried to wake Helen, her heart pounding with concern. Within minutes, the ranch was a flurry of activity as men gathered equipment, filled water barrels, and saddled horses. Helen immediately took charge of organizing provisions, directing Mrs. Abernathy and Sarah in the kitchen. "Gabriella," Helen called, "can you help gather canteens and bandages? If anyone's injured fighting the fire, we'll need supplies." For the next hour, Gabriella worked alongside the women, preparing for the worst while praying it wouldn't come to that. Through the kitchen window, she watched as Xavier led a team of 20 ranch hands out of the yard, their faces grim with determination. As the night deepened, Helen paced the kitchen, her usual composure frayed by worry. "The mares and foals," she murmured. "Our best breeding stock is in that pasture." "Could they move them in time?" Gabriella asked, placing a comforting hand on Helen's arm. Helen shook her head uncertainly. "If the fire is moving as quickly as Jessup said, They may have to focus on creating fire breaks rather than evacuating the horses. She met Gabriella's eyes. They might have to open the gates and hope the horses have the sense to run from the flames on their own. The thought of the frightened animals, particularly the young foals, facing a wildfire alone sent a chill through Gabriella. She thought of her father's teachings about how horses behaved in emergencies, their panic, their instinct to flee, but also their tendency to become disoriented by smoke. "Helen," she said suddenly, "I know those northern pastures. Xavier showed them to me last week when we were exercising the yearlings. There's a creek that runs along the eastern edge, isn't there?" Helen nodded. "Yes, though it's running low this time of year." "But it would still provide a natural fire break," Gabriella continued, an idea forming. "And beyond it lies the box canyon where Xavier said you sometimes winter the hardier stock." Understanding dawned in Helen's eyes. "You're thinking the horses could be driven there for safety?" "Yes," Gabriella confirmed, "but someone would need to guide them. In their panic, they might not find the way on their own." Helen studied her for a long moment. "You're suggesting you go?" It wasn't a question, but Gabriella nodded anyway. "I understand horse behavior in emergencies. My father and I once had to evacuate our entire stable during a flash flood. I can help." Helen's expression was torn between concern and recognition of the logic in Gabriella's plan. "Xavier would never forgive me if I sent you into danger." "And could you forgive yourself if those foals perished when I might have helped?" Gabriella countered gently. After a moment of internal struggle, Helen nodded decisively. "Take Thunder, he's the fastest mount in the stable besides Xavier's stallion. And take Penny too, a familiar presence might help calm the mares." She gripped Gabriella's hands tightly. "But promise me you'll turn back if the fire is too close. No horses are worth your life." "I promise," Gabriella agreed, already moving toward the door. Within minutes, she had saddled Thunder and secured a lead rope to bring Penny along. Dressed in sturdy riding clothes and with a damp cloth to cover her face against the smoke, she mounted and rode out of the ranch yard, heading north toward the distant orange glow that illuminated the night sky. The journey to the northern pastures took nearly an hour at a hard gallop. As Gabriella crested the final ridge, the full scope of the disaster came into view. The fire had created a wall of flames that advanced steadily across the dry summer grass, driven by the wind toward the pasture where Silvercrest's prized broodmares and their foals were kept. She could see Xavier and his men working frantically to dig fire breaks and beat back the advancing flames with wet blankets. They were making progress, but it was clear they couldn't contain the entire fire front. Gabriella urged Thunder around the edge of the firefighting activity, Penny following obediently behind. She caught glimpses of the horses in the pasture, already agitated by the smell of smoke and the distant glow of flames. She had nearly reached the pasture when a familiar voice called her name with a mixture of shock and anger. "Gabriella, what in God's name are you doing here?" Xavier rode toward her, his face streaked with soot, his expression thunderous. In the firelight, his eyes were almost silver, reflecting the dancing flames. "The horses," she explained quickly. "Helen and I thought you should be at the ranch safe," he cut her off, guiding his horse alongside Thunder. "This is no place for what? A woman." Gabriella challenged, her chin lifting. "Mr. Thornton, we don't have time to argue. Those mares and foals need to be moved to the box canyon beyond the creek. It's their best chance." Xavier stared at her, conflict evident in his expression. Behind him, the fire crackled and roared, advancing inexorably toward the pasture. "The men are needed on the fire line," Gabriella continued urgently. "I can lead the horses to safety. I brought Penny to help calm them." For a moment longer, Xavier hesitated. Then, with a curt nod, he reached a decision. "I'll come with you. Johnson can manage the men." He called orders to his foreman, then turned back to Gabriella. "Stay close to me. The smoke can disorient you quickly." Together they rode to the pasture gate. Inside, nearly 30 mares and their foals milled nervously, some beginning to run in panicked circles as the smell of smoke grew stronger. "We need to move them calmly," Xavier shouted over the distant roar of the fire. "If they bolt in the wrong direction, we'll lose them to the flames." Gabriella nodded, slipping from Thunder's back to open the gate. "I'll take Penny in first. The mares know her now, they might follow her lead." Xavier looked like he wanted to object, but instead dismounted as well. "I'll work the edges of the herd. Keep them moving east toward the creek." With Penny on a lead rope, Gabriella entered the pasture, speaking in soothing tones to the agitated horses. "Easy, ladies. That's it. Follow Penny now." Xavier remounted and began carefully guiding the outlying mares and foals toward the eastern fence line. His presence was commanding but calm, providing direction without adding to the horses' fear. Gradually, the herd began to move as a unit, following Penny and Gabriella toward the open gate. Once through, Gabriella led them along a trail that paralleled the creek, moving steadily toward the box canyon that would provide shelter from both fire and wind. The journey was tense, with several foals becoming separated from their mothers in the confusion. Each time, either Gabriella or Xavier would circle back, gently guiding the young horses back to the herd. The smoke grew thicker as they moved, and Gabriella pulled the damp cloth over her nose and mouth, her eyes stinging. Xavier stayed close, his focus divided between managing the herd and watching over Gabriella. Once, when a fallen branch spooked several mares, threatening to turn the entire herd back toward the fire, he maneuvered his horse with expert precision to prevent the stampede, his voice steady as he calmed the frightened animals. After what seemed like hours but was likely less than one, they reached the narrow entrance to the box canyon. Inside, the horses would be protected on 3 sides by steep rock walls, with the creek providing a natural barrier at the entrance. "They'll be safe here," Xavier confirmed as the last of the foals trotted into the canyon, rejoining its mother. "The fire won't jump the creek, and even if it did, there's nothing to burn on these rocky slopes." Gabriella nodded, exhaustion suddenly washing over her as the immediate danger passed. She leaned against Penny's solid warmth, her legs trembling from the strain of the past hours. Xavier dismounted and approached her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. For a moment, Gabriella thought he might reprimand her for disregarding his implicit order to remain at the ranch. Instead, he reached out and gently wiped a smudge of soot from her cheek with his thumb. "You saved them," he said simply, his voice rough with emotion. "Every mare, every foal, all safe because of your quick thinking." Gabriella looked up at him, surprised by the raw admiration in his gaze. "We saved them together," she corrected softly. Xavier's hand lingered on her face, his touch gentle despite the calluses on his fingers. "When I saw you riding toward the fire," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "my heart nearly stopped." "The thought of you in danger," he broke off, seeming to struggle with his words. In that moment, with the distant glow of the fire painting golden highlights in his hair and the smell of smoke and pine surrounding them, Gabriella recognized the emotion he couldn't express: fear, concern, and something deeper, something that mirrored the feelings growing in her own heart. "I couldn't stay behind knowing I could help," she explained, her voice equally soft. "These horses, your horses, they matter to me now too." Xavier's eyes searched hers, and whatever he found there seemed to resolve some inner conflict. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, he leaned down and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, as if he expected her to push him away. But Gabriella found herself responding, her hands coming up to rest against his chest as she leaned into the embrace. When they finally parted, Xavier rested his forehead against hers, his breathing uneven. "Forgive me," he murmured. "That was presumptuous." "Yes, it was," Gabriella agreed, but there was no censure in her tone. She offered him a small smile, but not unwelcome. Relief flickered across his features, followed by something warmer. He might have spoken again, but the sound of approaching riders interrupted the moment. They stepped apart as several ranch hands appeared at the canyon entrance, sent by the foreman to check on their progress with the horses. "All present and accounted for, boss," Xavier confirmed as the men dismounted to help secure the makeshift corral. "Thanks to Miss Morgan's quick thinking." The men cast curious glances between Xavier and Gabriella, but were too disciplined to comment on the unusual situation or the obvious tension between them. As the first hint of dawn lightened the eastern sky, Xavier approached Gabriella where she sat on a rock, resting after the night's exertions. "The fire is contained," he informed her. "The men will stay with the horses until we can safely move them back to their regular pasture." He extended his hand to help her up. "We should return to the ranch. Helen will be worried." Gabriella accepted his assistance, noting how he didn't immediately release her hand after she stood. "Is everyone safe? No injuries?" "Minor burns and smoke inhalation. Nothing serious," he assured her. "Johnson's already taken the injured men back." They rode side by side as they returned to Silvercrest, the rising sun revealing the blackened landscape where the fire had passed. Despite the devastation, Gabriella felt a strange sense of peace. Something had changed between her and Xavier, something significant, and while its exact nature remained undefined, she sensed it held promise. Helen was waiting anxiously in the yard when they arrived, rushing forward to embrace first her brother, then Gabriella. "Thank God you're both safe," she exclaimed, stepping back to examine them. Her sharp eyes noted their soot-stained clothes and Xavier's protective stance beside Gabriella. "And the horses? All safe in the box canyon," Xavier confirmed. "Miss Morgan's plan worked perfectly." Helen's relief was palpable. "I knew it would. She has her father's understanding of horses." She linked her arm through Gabriella's. "Come inside, both of you. Mrs. Abernathy has breakfast waiting and you look dead on your feet." As they followed Helen toward the house, Xavier's hand brushed against Gabriella's, a brief, deliberate touch that sent warmth through her despite her exhaustion. Their eyes met briefly, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. Whatever had begun in the firelight of that dangerous night, both knew it was only the beginning. The days following the fire brought a flurry of activity to Silvercrest. Fences needed repair. The mares and foals were gradually returned to their regular pastures, and the damage to the northern grazing lands had to be assessed. Through it all, Gabriella worked alongside the ranch hands, her status subtly shifting from new employee to respected member of the Silvercrest family. Xavier's behavior toward her had changed as well. While maintaining proper decorum in public, he sought her company more frequently, inviting her to ride with him to check the property boundaries, or asking her opinion on training methods for the younger horses. Their conversations grew deeper, more personal, as they shared stories of their pasts and hopes for the future. One afternoon, nearly 2 weeks after the fire, Xavier found Gabriella in the stable, brushing Penny's coat to a gleaming shine. "She looks magnificent," he commented, leaning against the stall door. "You've given her excellent care." Gabriella smiled, continuing her rhythmic strokes along the mare's flank. "She deserves it. I sometimes think she's happier here than she was on our farm. More space to run, more equine company. Xavier studied her for a moment. And what about her mistress? Is she happy here as well? The question, though softly spoken, carried weight. Gabriella set down the brush and turned to face him fully. Yes, she answered honestly. Happier than I expected to be after losing everything. Something flickered in Xavier's eyes, relief, perhaps, or deeper emotion. I'm glad to hear it. I've been meaning to speak with you about your position here. Gabriella's heart skipped a beat. Was he planning to change her duties? Or worse, had he decided her presence was somehow problematic after their moment in the box canyon? My position, she echoed cautiously. Xavier straightened, his expression growing more formal. Yes, you've been with us for nearly a month now. Your initial arrangement was temporary, as I recall. That's true, Gabriella acknowledged, her throat suddenly dry. You offered me a week's trial with the promise of passage to Sacramento if I wished to leave. Do you? The question was direct, his gaze intense as he awaited her answer. No, she replied softly. I have no desire to leave Silvercrest. Relief visibly washed over Xavier's features. I'm pleased to hear it. In that case, I'd like to offer you a permanent position as our head trainer for the gentler stock and the riding horses we sell to families and ladies. The offer was generous, far more responsibility and presumably better pay than her current arrangement. Yet Gabriella couldn't help feeling a twinge of disappointment. After their kiss, after the connection they'd been building, was a professional relationship all he wanted. That's very kind, Mr. Thornton, she said carefully. I would be honored to accept such a position. Xavier nodded, seemingly satisfied, but then hesitated. There's something else I'd like to discuss with you, but not here. He glanced around the stable where several ranch hands were working nearby. Would you ride with me this afternoon? There's a place I'd like to show you. Curiosity piqued, Gabriella agreed. Of course. When would you like to leave? An hour. I need to review some paperwork with Helen first. I'll be ready, she promised. True to his word, Xavier was waiting in the yard an hour later, 2 horses saddled and ready. To Gabriella's surprise, he had prepared Penny for her rather than one of the ranch horses she usually rode. I thought you might prefer your own mount today, he explained as he helped her into the saddle, his hands lingering slightly at her waist. They rode north, away from the burned areas, following a winding trail that climbed gradually into the foothills. Xavier pointed out various landmarks along the way: a natural spring, a stand of pine trees that provided shelter for deer in winter, the distant peaks where he sometimes hunted in the fall. After about an hour's ride, they crested a gentle rise, and a small valley opened before them. A clear stream meandered through lush grass, and a stand of aspen trees provided dappled shade at one end. It was a natural paradise, sheltered from the wind by surrounding hills. It's beautiful, Gabriella breathed, taking in the peaceful scene. Xavier nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression. This is part of Silvercrest, the newest edition. I purchased it last month from a neighbor who was moving back east. He guided his horse down the slope toward the aspens. I thought it might make an excellent breeding nursery for our most valuable mares and foals. They dismounted near the stream, allowing the horses to drink while they walked along the bank. Xavier seemed unusually nervous, picking up stones and skipping them across a wider pool in the stream. You mentioned another matter you wished to discuss, Gabriella prompted gently when the silence stretched between them. Xavier drew a deep breath, turning to face her directly. Yes, it's of a personal nature. He hesitated, then continued more firmly. Miss Morgan, Gabriella, my feelings for you have grown beyond what would be appropriate between employer and employee. Gabriella's heart began to race, but she remained silent, allowing him to continue. Since the night of the fire, no, if I'm being honest. Since I first saw you sitting alone at that auction, you've occupied my thoughts in a way no one ever has before. He took a step closer. I find myself seeking your company, valuing your opinions, admiring your courage and intelligence. Mr. Thornton, Gabriella began, but he held up a hand. Xavier, please, he requested. At least for this conversation, she nodded. Xavier. He seemed to gather strength from hearing his name on her lips. I brought you here today because this place represents possibility to me, new beginnings, growth, a future. His storm-gray eyes held her steadily. I'd like to know if you could envision a future at Silvercrest not as an employee, but as its mistress, as my wife. Though she had begun to suspect the direction of his thoughts, the actual proposal still took Gabriella's breath away. She searched his face, finding nothing but sincere emotion in his expression. This seems sudden, she said carefully. We've known each other only a month. I know my own mind and heart, Xavier replied without hesitation. But I understand if you need time to consider. I'm not asking for an immediate answer. Gabriella's thoughts whirled. Marriage to Xavier would secure her future, provide stability she hadn't known since before her father's death. But more than that, it would mean building a life with a man she had come to admire deeply, a man whose touch made her heart race, whose rare smiles lit something warm inside her. If I were to accept, she said slowly, would you expect me to give up working with the horses? Xavier looked surprised by the question. Of course not. Your talent with them is exceptional. I would never ask you to abandon something that brings you such joy. He smiled slightly. Though I might insist you avoid riding directly into forest fires in the future. His teasing reference to that night lightened the moment, drawing a small laugh from Gabriella. That seems a reasonable condition. Xavier took her hand gently in his. Gabriella, I'm not offering marriage as a business arrangement or out of some misplaced sense of protection. I'm offering it because I believe we could build something meaningful together, a partnership in the truest sense. His voice softened. I believe I'm falling in love with you, unlikely as that might have seemed when I first saw you at that auction. The simple, honest declaration touched Gabriella deeply. In the past month, her feelings for Xavier had grown from cautious gratitude to genuine affection, and yes, something that felt remarkably like love. His strength, his integrity, his occasional stubbornness, his devotion to his sister and his land all had become dear to her. I don't need more time, she said finally, meeting his gaze steadily. My answer is yes, Xavier. I would be honored to become your wife. Relief and joy transformed his features. Gently, reverently, he drew her into his arms and kissed her, not with the uncertain hesitation of their first kiss, but with the confidence of a man who had found what he had been seeking. When they parted, Xavier rested his forehead against hers. Helen will be delighted, he murmured. She's been dropping hints about you since your second week at Silvercrest. Gabriella laughed softly. She's very perceptive, your sister. Too perceptive sometimes, Xavier agreed with a chuckle. Then, growing more serious, he asked, would you be content with a small wedding? Perhaps just family and the ranch hands, or would you prefer something more elaborate in Carson City? Small and intimate would be perfect, Gabriella assured him. Silvercrest is my home now. I can't imagine being married anywhere else. The joy in Xavier's eyes at her words confirmed that she had made the right decision. Together they walked back to where the horses grazed peacefully. Penny and Xavier's stallion standing side by side in the dappled shade, a picture that seemed to symbolize their own new partnership. As Xavier helped her mount, Gabriella realized that fate had led her to that auction for a purpose far greater than selling her beloved horse. It had led her to a new beginning, a new home, and a love she hadn't dared to hope for. The news of their engagement spread quickly through Silvercrest. Helen was indeed delighted, embracing Gabriella warmly, and declaring that she had known from the beginning that they were perfectly suited. "My brother needed someone with your spirit," she confided as they sat together on the porch that evening, watching Xavier discuss the next day's work with George across the yard. Someone who wouldn't be intimidated by his occasional gruffness. Someone who could match his passion for this land and these horses. "I never expected to find this," Gabriella admitted, twisting the simple silver band Xavier had placed on her finger that afternoon, a temporary token until they could visit Carson City for a proper ring. "When my father died and we lost the farm, I thought that chapter of my life, horses, a home of my own, was over forever." Helen patted her hand affectionately. "Life has a way of opening new doors when others close. Xavier and I learned that after our parents died." She glanced at her brother, her expression softening. "I haven't seen him this happy since before the war." The wedding was set for 3 weeks later, enough time to prepare, but not so long that it would interfere with the ranch's operations. In the meantime, Gabriella continued her work with the horses, now with the added responsibility of selecting and training mounts specifically for the female riders among their clientele. Xavier, true to his word, treated her as a partner in the ranch's operations. He sought her input on breeding decisions, included her in discussions about upcoming horse sales, and began teaching her about the business aspects of running Silvercrest. "You should understand every facet of the operation," he explained one evening as they reviewed the ranch's ledgers together in his study. "If anything were to happen to me, you and Helen would need to carry on." "Nothing is going to happen to you," Gabriella replied firmly, leaning against his shoulder as they sat side by side at his desk. "But I appreciate your trust in me." Xavier turned his head to place a gentle kiss on her temple. "It's not just trust, Gabriella, it's recognition of your capabilities." He closed the ledger and turned to face her more fully. "You've transformed Silvercrest in the short time you've been here. The horses respond differently, the men respect your knowledge, even Helen seems more relaxed with another woman to share responsibilities." Gabriella felt a blush rise to her cheeks at his praise. "I've simply found my place," she said softly. "Something I feared I might never do again after losing my father and our farm." Xavier's expression grew thoughtful. "I've been meaning to ask, would you like to visit your father's grave before the wedding? Carson City isn't far, and I know how much he meant to you." The suggestion touched Gabriella deeply. "I would like that very much," she admitted. "I haven't been able to visit since the funeral. There wasn't time before I had to leave." "Then we'll go tomorrow," Xavier decided. "We need to select your ring anyway, and there are a few supplies the ranch needs." True to his word, Xavier arranged for them to travel to Carson City the following day. They rode in the ranch wagon, the journey providing several hours of uninterrupted conversation as they discussed their hopes for the future. "I'd like to expand the breeding program," Xavier shared as they traveled the dusty road toward town. "With your expertise, we could develop a line specifically known for temperament and trainability, not just conformation and speed." "I'd like that," Gabriella agreed enthusiastically. "My father always believed that a horse's character was as important as its physical attributes." "And what about children?" Xavier asked, his voice softening as he broached the more personal topic. "Would you want a large family?" Gabriella considered the question thoughtfully. "I was an only child, and while I never lacked for love, I sometimes wished for siblings. I think I'd like several children, enough to fill Silvercrest with laughter and ensure the ranch passes to the next generation." The look Xavier gave her was filled with such tenderness that Gabriella felt her heart might overflow. "I'd like that too," he said simply. Their first stop in Carson City was the small cemetery on the outskirts of town. Xavier waited respectfully at a distance while Gabriella knelt beside her father's simple headstone, brushing away the dust that had accumulated in the 3 months since his passing. "I wish you could have met him, Papa," she whispered, tracing the carved letters of his name. "Xavier is everything you hoped I would find: strong, honorable, kind beneath his reserved exterior." She smiled softly. "And he loves horses almost as much as you did." After several minutes of quiet communion, she felt Xavier's presence behind her. He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder in silent support. "He would have liked you," Gabriella said, looking up at him, "especially after seeing how well you care for Penny." Xavier helped her to her feet, keeping her hand in his. "I wish I could have known him," he replied sincerely. "The man who raised such a remarkable daughter must have been exceptional himself." They visited the jeweler next, where Xavier insisted that Gabriella select whatever ring pleased her most. She chose a modest gold band set with a small sapphire, elegant but practical, something she could wear even while working with the horses. "Are you certain?" Xavier asked as she tried it on. "We could look at more elaborate options." Gabriella shook her head, admiring the way the deep blue stone caught the light. "This is perfect, beautiful but sturdy, rather like Silvercrest itself." Xavier's smile indicated his approval of her comparison. He paid for the ring, instructing the jeweler to engrave their initials and wedding date inside the band. As they completed their other errands in town, Gabriella was aware of the curious glances they received. Carson City was a small community, and news traveled fast. Several people approached Xavier to offer congratulations, having already heard of their engagement through the efficient frontier telegraph of gossip. "Is it strange?" Xavier asked as they loaded their purchases into the wagon for the return journey. "Being the subject of such interest." Gabriella considered the question. "A little," she admitted. 3 months ago, I was just the daughter of a failing horse breeder. Now I'm about to become Mrs. Xavier Thornton, mistress of Silvercrest Ranch." She adjusted her bonnet against the afternoon sun. "It's a significant change in circumstances." Xavier helped her onto the wagon seat, his hands lingering at her waist. "Having second thoughts?" he asked, a hint of vulnerability in his question. "Not even for a moment," Gabriella assured him, meeting his gaze directly. "My circumstances have changed, Xavier, but who I am has not. And who you are, the man I've come to love, is what matters to me, not the size of your ranch or your standing in the community." Her honest declaration seemed to touch something deep within him. Before helping her onto the wagon seat, he pulled her close for a brief but tender kiss, heedless of the interested onlookers on the busy street. "I love you, Gabriella Morgan," he said softly, the words clearly not coming easily to this reserved man. "More than I thought possible when I saw you sitting alone at that auction." The return journey to Silvercrest seemed shorter somehow, filled as it was with shared plans and growing anticipation for their wedding day. As they approached the ranch, the setting sun gilded the buildings and surrounding landscape with golden light, making the property appear almost magical. "It's beautiful," Gabriella murmured, taking in the sight of what would soon officially be her home. Xavier followed her gaze, pride evident in his expression. "More beautiful now that you're here to share it," he replied simply. The weeks leading up to the wedding passed in a blur of activity. Helen took charge of the preparations, transforming the ranch yard into a suitable venue for the ceremony and subsequent celebration. Women from neighboring ranches brought food and decorations, while the men constructed temporary tables and a small platform where the ceremony would take place. The evening before the wedding, Gabriella sat with Helen on the porch, enjoying a rare moment of quiet amid the preparations. Inside the house, several neighbor women were putting final touches on Gabriella's wedding dress, a simple but elegant creation of ivory silk that Helen had helped her select. "Are you nervous?" Helen asked, pouring them each a small glass of sherry. Gabriella accepted the glass with a small smile. "Not about marrying Xavier," she replied honestly. "But perhaps a little about the ceremony itself. Being the center of attention isn't something I'm accustomed to." Helen chuckled. "The advantage of a frontier wedding is its brevity. Judge Peterson isn't known for lengthy sermons, and everyone will be too eager for the celebration afterward to drag out the formalities." "Where is Xavier this evening?" Gabriella asked, realizing she hadn't seen her fiancé since midday. George insisted on a small gathering at the bunkhouse, a bachelor's farewell of sorts, Helen explained with a hint of amusement. "Nothing too rowdy, I made him promise. Just cards and perhaps a bottle of whiskey among the senior hands." Gabriella smiled at the thought of Xavier participating in such traditional male bonding. Despite his growing openness with her, he remained somewhat reserved with others. "He's changed since you came," Helen observed, seeming to read Gabriella's thoughts. "There's a lightness to him I haven't seen in years." "He's brought light to my life as well," Gabriella replied softly. "After my father died, I couldn't imagine finding happiness again, let alone love." Helen raised her glass in a small toast. "To unexpected blessings," she said warmly. Gabriella clinked her glass against Helen's. "And to new beginnings." The wedding day dawned clear and warm, a perfect early summer morning. As tradition dictated, Xavier spent the night in the bunkhouse, leaving Gabriella to prepare in the main house with Helen's assistance. "You look beautiful," Helen declared as she secured the last pin in Gabriella's upswept hair, tucking a small sprig of wildflowers among the auburn curls. "Absolutely radiant." Gabriella studied her reflection in the mirror, hardly recognizing the composed, elegant woman who looked back at her. The ivory silk dress complemented her fair complexion, and the simple gold locket that had been her mother's, her only remaining keepsake, hung at her throat. "I wish my parents could be here," she said softly, touching the locket. Helen squeezed her shoulder gently. "They would be proud of you, Gabriella, and I know they would approve of Xavier." She checked the clock on the mantel. "It's nearly time. Are you ready?" Drawing a deep breath, Gabriella nodded. "More than ready." The ranch yard had been transformed for the occasion. Fresh-cut pine boughs decorated the small platform where Judge Peterson waited, and wildflowers adorned the simple benches arranged for guests. Nearly everyone from neighboring ranches had turned out, along with townspeople from Carson City, who did business with Silvercrest. As Gabriella emerged from the house on George's arm, the foreman having proudly agreed to give her away in her father's absence, a collective murmur of appreciation rose from the assembled guests. But Gabriella had eyes only for Xavier, who stood waiting for her before the judge. He was dressed in his best black suit, his sandy hair neatly combed, his usually weathered face freshly shaved. But it was the expression in his storm-gray eyes as he watched her approach that captured Gabriella's heart anew, a mixture of wonder, tenderness, and unmistakable love. When George placed her hand in Xavier's, the foreman's voice was suspiciously gruff as he responded to the judge's traditional question. "Her father would be proud to give this woman to this man, Your Honor." The ceremony itself was indeed brief, as Helen had predicted. Judge Peterson spoke eloquently about the sacred nature of marriage, particularly on the frontier where partnerships were tested daily by the challenges of building a life from the untamed land. When the time came to exchange vows, Xavier's voice was steady and clear, carrying across the hushed gathering. I, Xavier James Thornton, take you, Gabriella Elizabeth Morgan, to be my lawful wedded wife. I promise to love, honor, and protect you all the days of my life, to share with you both joy and hardship, to build our home and legacy together at Silvercrest, and to cherish you as God's greatest gift to me. Tears shimmered in Gabriella's eyes as she responded with her own vows, her voice growing stronger with each word. I, Gabriella Elizabeth Morgan, take you, Xavier James Thornton, to be my lawful wedded husband. I promise to love, honor, and support you all the days of my life, to stand beside you through whatever challenges we may face, to make our home a place of peace and happiness, and to cherish the love we have found together as my most precious blessing. Judge Peterson pronounced them husband and wife, and when Xavier kissed her gently but with unmistakable passion, the assembled guests erupted in cheers and applause. The celebration that followed lasted well into the evening. Tables groaned under the weight of food contributed by neighboring ranches. A fiddle player from Carson City provided lively music for dancing, and someone had brought several bottles of champagne for toasts to the happy couple. As twilight fell, lanterns were lit around the yard, casting a warm glow over the festivities. Xavier kept Gabriella close by his side throughout the evening, his hand often finding hers as they accepted congratulations and well wishes from their guests. "Happy, Mrs. Thornton," he murmured during a rare quiet moment as they stood slightly apart from the celebrations, watching their friends and neighbors enjoying themselves. The new name sent a pleasant shiver through Gabriella. "Completely," she assured him, leaning against his solid strength. "Though I must admit to some exhaustion after such a day." Understanding flickered in Xavier's eyes. Discreetly, he signaled to Helen, who immediately began the process of ushering guests toward departure. Goodbyes were said, final congratulations offered, and within half an hour, the last wagon was rolling down the drive toward Carson City. The ranch hands tactfully retired to the bunkhouse, while Helen announced her intention to stay with friends in town for a few days, to give the newlyweds some privacy. With a warm embrace for both Xavier and Gabriella, she departed in the buggy with the last of the neighbor women. Suddenly, Gabriella and Xavier found themselves alone in the main house, now their home together. An unexpected shyness fell between them as they stood in the parlor, the magnitude of the day's events and the commitment they had made finally sinking in fully. Xavier broke the silence first, taking Gabriella's hands in his. "I meant every word of my vows today," he said quietly. "You have brought something to Silvercrest and to me that I didn't even know was missing until you arrived." Gabriella's heart swelled with emotion. "And you have given me far more than shelter or security, Xavier. You've given me a home, a purpose, and a love I never expected to find." He drew her gently into his arms, his kiss tender but filled with promise. As they ascended the stairs to the master bedroom, now their shared sanctuary, Gabriella knew, with absolute certainty, that the path that had led her to that auction, to this man, and to Silvercrest had been guided by a hand wiser than her own. In the years that followed, Silvercrest Ranch flourished under the joint stewardship of Xavier and Gabriella Thornton. Their breeding program became renowned throughout the West for producing horses of exceptional temperament and trainability, with Penny's offspring particularly sought after for their intelligence and gentle disposition. Helen remained an integral part of the household, though she eventually moved into a smaller house built specially for her on the property, allowing the main house to accommodate the growing Thornton family. For grow it did first with the arrival of James Edward Thornton, named for both his grandfathers, followed 2 years later by Elizabeth Helen, who inherited her mother's auburn hair and her father's storm-gray eyes. By the time their third child, Thomas, arrived, Silvercrest had nearly doubled in size, with new pastures, expanded stables, and a reputation that drew buyers from as far away as San Francisco and even the East Coast. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Xavier presented Gabriella with a special gift, the deed to the small valley where he had proposed, now transformed into a private sanctuary with a small cabin where they could occasionally escape the busy ranch for moments of peace together. "For the woman who changed everything," he said as he handed her the ribbon-tied document. "The woman who was sitting alone at an auction, not knowing she was about to come home with me." Gabriella, her eyes shining with love and memories, reached up to touch his face, more lined now from years of working outdoors, but still as dear to her as it had been that first day. "The best decision I ever made," she replied softly, "was trusting the cowboy who said I was coming home with him." And as Xavier drew her into his embrace, the setting sun casting long shadows across the prosperous ranch they had built together, both knew that the journey that had begun at that Carson City auction had led them exactly where they were meant to be, home, in each other's arms, with a legacy of love that would endure for generations to come.